Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for tuning in tonight as we kick off a new season of Conservation Conversations. My name is Ed Pritchard, and I work for Miami Eco Adventures. We're a unit of the Miami-Dade County Parks Department and a co-host of this webinar series alongside Anna Zangroniz of UF-IFAS Extension and Florida Sea Grant. For those that are new to our series, welcome, and thank you for taking the time tonight. We host these webinars every second Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. and we feature a different conservation topic and expert each month. A few housekeeping items just before we get started with the webinar. So at the moment, everyone is currently on mute and our video cameras are off. We would like for you guys to remain that way, but we want to hear from you. So if you do have questions for the speaker, we will have some time at the end of the presentation to take those questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box located at the bottom of the screen there. And then I'll be moderating that and we will answer those questions with the speaker at the end. We also have some polls in this presentation, so we encourage you to participate in those. Quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be shared in the next few days. So feel free to share that with others that weren't able to join. And you can also follow us on our social media pages. At Miami Eco Adventures and at Miami-Dade Sea Grant. We will advertise upcoming topics for these webinars, and we'll also showcase related content. If you'd like to actually receive an email, like a reminder with a monthly conservation topic and the registration link, you can email Anna. She'll put her email address in the chat, and you can send an email to her for those. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Anna for tonight's presentation. Anna, take it away.
Great, Ed, thank you. And thanks for everybody who is joining us, and want to recognize our folks who have been with us for a long time and for those who are joining us for their first conservation conversation. We're here to talk today about Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch in Miami-Dade County. And since you can't see me right now, I thought I'd just provide a visual. I picked a pretty professional looking photo. Sometimes most of the field photos I have look pretty awkward, but I thought this was a good one. And I am the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent based here in Miami-Dade County. My position is part of the University of Florida IFAS Extension Service, Florida Sea Grant, and Miami-Dade County Parks and Rec. So if you have any questions or you're just completely confused about all of that, you can put it in the chat or I can answer that later. Tonight, we're going to be starting first with a little bit of information about horseshoe crabs. Then we will move into discussion about citizen science. I will talk a little bit about the logistics and the inception of Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch. I will then zoom in more specifically on the program here within Miami-Dade County. And then I will talk a little bit about ways that folks can get involved. And we're going to start first by talking about the horseshoe crab or the Atlantic horseshoe crab. These are really interesting creatures. These are, in fact, arthropods, not true crustaceans like crabs and lobsters. These are more closely related to sea spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. And horseshoe crabs have 5 sets of jointed legs, and their body is divided into 3 major parts: the prosoma, or the very top portion, the opistosoma, or the back portion, and the telson, or their tail. And horseshoe crabs are different from most other invertebrates in that they take a long time to reach maturity, about 10 years on average. You may have heard things like horseshoe crabs are living fossils or they're very, very ancient, and that is true. And in fact, there's a term I just learned that phylogenetic or evolutionary relics. So in other words, these creatures are considered to be evolutionarily static. And that's because this lineage has persisted for more than 200 million years. And the fossil forms of the horseshoe crab date back even longer, to about 450 million years ago. And that predates the dinosaurs, which are most often how we consider organisms and their age in our history. And the lineage of our horseshoe crab has survived millions of years, including many mass extinctions. And today, there are 4 species of horseshoe crabs that remain. 3 very closely related Asian species, and now Limulus polyphemus, the Atlantic horseshoe crab, which has been on its own path since the Jurassic era. I'm briefly going to touch upon why horseshoe crabs are important. And there are 3 main categories that are discussed. And the first is birds. And not just that birds are important to horseshoe crabs, but that the eggs of horseshoe crabs are an important food source for migrating birds. And not just migrating birds, but many other marine species, including sea turtles, fish, crabs, which not only feed on horseshoe crab eggs, but also the larvae of horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs are an important bait source for both the American eel and whelk fisheries, which are commercial fisheries in different parts of this country. And lastly, the third B, birds, bait, and the last is biomedical. And this is significant to the medical industry because horseshoe crabs have copper-based blood, which appears blue when it's exposed to air. And within the blood, there are blood cells that contain chemicals that cause the blood to clot when exposed to gram-negative bacteria. And if you consider everything that we have with modern medicine, this is really, really important because this essentially helps to determine whether certain knives or needles or syringes are sterile. And this is critical when we consider vaccines and surgeries. So if you've ever gotten a shot or gone to the doctor or had some sort of surgery, horseshoe crabs have helped you in some way. Here in the United States, this is a map that shows just the extent of the range of the horseshoe crab. And it's a pretty extensive area. If you look at this map, you will see that horseshoe crabs have been found all the way up the Atlantic coast, up towards Maine, and all the way down the Atlantic coast, coming around the Atlantic coast of Florida and into the Gulf side of Florida, as well as off the coast of Mexico. So within the main species that we're discussing, the Limulus polyphemus, there are 11 subpopulations within the US and 3 subpopulations in Mexico. And within Florida, horseshoe crabs breed in all coastal counties, and their populations are higher on the Gulf Coast. They do breed or spawn all year round, but there are peaks which are associated during the spring and fall seasons. They have been spotted in the Florida Keys and the Marquesas, but there are no reports of the horseshoe crabs having made it as far west as the dry tortugas, which makes sense because that's an area that's about 70 miles southwest of Key West. So it's a pretty far distance with lots of deep water, which is not where they inhabit. They inhabit near shore, shallow water, estuaries, mud flats, tidal flats. This is a graphic that was put out by a scientist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in a paper that came in 2016. And it's a little clunky. And so I'm going to simplify it a tad for you so you can just get an idea of some of the threats that horseshoe crabs face today. So if we look at this, we're going to cover up a little bit. We're going to begin by examining the things on the right. And those are the stressors to horseshoe crabs. So we have things including exploitation, so the consumption for bait, their blood compounds, and use in the aquarium trade. Habitat loss, which is affected by a number of different factors. And these affect how large the population of the horseshoe crabs are, how quickly they're growing, where are they being found, to what extent. If we now uncover that first blue block in the center, we'll see the sources of these stressors. And that includes fisheries management practices, the regulations surrounding the harvest of horseshoe crabs. We also have to highly consider coastal management practices and shoreline development. So those are the main factors that feed into the stressors that eventually can affect the horseshoe crabs population. And lastly, if we look under the blue block all the way to the left, are the suggested actions that can be taken to try and help improve horseshoe crab populations. And that includes regulations set as well as best management practices for harvest and fishing, as well as experiments with the propagation or rearing of horseshoe crabs, as well as opportunities for habitat restoration to ensure that horseshoe crabs have this adequate area in which to come ashore and lay their eggs. So it's a little clunky at first, but I think it's pretty cool. On a personal level, I would have preferred to see it go from left to right, but that's just me. The conservation status of the American horseshoe crab is complicated. If you were to look up on the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List, which is a science-based repository online, this is their scale in which they categorize different species. And if you type in American horseshoe crab, you will see that it's listed as vulnerable. However, that is a really general categorization because they're making that determination for the species at large, which, as we've just discussed, has 14 subpopulations that vary quite differently in geographic location as well as population. And so the question really is, we don't know. We don't really know what the status is of the horseshoe crab, the various horseshoe crab subpopulations. So yeah, things like that, the level of exploitation or harvest, habitat conditions, local climate conditions. So it's never really been comprehensively reviewed or addressed. And that applies to here in Florida. There's just not enough data to know. This has been a species that has been largely understudied around the world as well as in Florida. So I want that to just marinate around in your head a little bit when we transition to talk about citizen science. We're going to come back to this question of we don't know, because it's the foundation of why we're here and why we're having this webinar. Citizen science is a term that has been used pretty frequently, and it's been getting a lot more press recently. And there are several different definitions, but essentially, citizen science can be defined as utilizing the public to gather scientific information. And it's also defined as a partnership between members of the community and academic scientists that can address scientific questions and issues of common concern. And this approach, this technique, is a very effective platform to collect necessary data as well as engage different groups within larger communities. People participate for a number of different reasons. For some, it's interesting. Their interest is piqued. They want to learn more. There might be personal reasons or professional reasons in which a particular project or issue can be very close to home for them. They want to learn. People want to learn more. The learning doesn't stop once you finish high school or college or your graduate experience. And for many people, they might have pursued one field of study, but still have a strong interest or passion for a different one, which just increases their aptitude for learning. And a lot of folks want to lend a helping hand. Many projects, especially governmental agency projects, are quite limited by the amount of money they receive, as well as they have the staff available to carry them out. And largely, in my experience, a lot of people do this because they enjoy it. They have fun, they were interested in it, and they've taken it on, and it has just opened up a different world for them. Citizen science projects can be set up with different goals in mind. And these are a number of the most common, including policy related, educational or awareness related, site or species management, research, capacity building. And a lot of these will overlap. Many projects will share 2 to 3 or even 4 of these as tenets or cores of why the project was implemented. Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch is a species management based project. And this is because trying to find out about geographic distribution and population growth rates, those 2 topics are critical for fish and wildlife managers to make decisions with. So that is what Florida Horseshoe Crab is largely focused on. Enter Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch, or Linked with Limulus. This is a statewide citizen science program that is a partnership effort between Florida Fish and Wildlife, University of Florida IFAS Extension and the Nature Coast Biological Station, and Florida Sea Grant. And this program was created and launched in 2015 with those goals of trying to understand the geographic distribution and population size of Florida's horseshoe crabs. So there was a need. There was this calling for information that was lacking. Excuse me. Back in 2002, Florida Fish and Wildlife, or FWC, began asking the public to submit reports of horseshoe crab sightings. And people did it. They entered their information. However, the data that were submitted were not always precise and only provided presence information or where the crabs were spotted. So it was understood that this needed to be scaled up and data collected in a slightly different way. And so I can speak for IFAS Extension. We are firm believers in not reinventing the wheel. So the individuals that put together this program reviewed the literature and examined other programs out there and ultimately decided to model Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch based on the Delaware Bay horseshoe crab surveys that had been going on since the late 90s. There were some modifications made because Florida's horseshoe crab populations are not nearly to the extent of Delaware Bay, but by and large, the protocol is quite similar. And so this Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch is looking for reports or looking to survey during spawning seasons. Okay, so things to factor in mind. If any of you have participated in different citizen science projects, perhaps hopefully it was well designed and executed, so you just jump right in and really didn't have to think about much. And in my opinion and experience, this is the best type of program. And here are some examples of some of the considerations that went into this statewide program. And the first is, where are these surveys going to take place? So the survey sites were determined, at least initially, through those public sighting reports provided by FWC. So those public reports, if someone was on a beach or at a marina and submitted it, that was a great first step in determining if that was a suitable site to survey. Then looking at an area and determining, is this a place that's appropriate? Is it a publicly accessible area? Is it walkable? If it's walkable, how far is it to walk from the parking lot to that beach? Or is it not walkable at all and only accessible by paddlecraft? Likewise, is this a paid entry or is it a free entry area? So these are other factors to consider. Another aspect was whether or not these surveys were going to take place both at daytime high tides as well as night. And the answer to that here for this program is no. From both a safety perspective as well as access perspective, the Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch program surveys only take place during daytime high tides. Another important factor is permits. You can't just go and pick up horseshoe crabs and measure them and weigh them and tag them without getting permission. Usually, I would say 1 to 3 levels of permission, definitely from FWC, Fish and Wildlife Service, and then usually the county or municipality involved in the project. The next consideration with the picture that did not animate in as I had planned is the size of the transect or the survey area. Is this a really, really tiny beach that can easily be surveyed? Or is this a large expansive beach in which maybe it's most appropriate to only survey one section of it or 2 sections of it? So looking and considering what the ask is of folks and what's going to warrant the best survey situation and the best potential data. And then lastly, who is going to be that unicorn individual, that person who's going to serve as the county level coordinator? There is a state level coordinator for Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch who is in charge of managing and herding all of the county level cats, and the county level folks run the program within their respective county. So these are probably the most important considerations for setting up this project. If you Google Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch, you will hit this landing page. And the woman who built it, Berlina Harris, she just retired as the statewide coordinator of this program and has moved into a new role. But lucky for me, she is still close by and happy to answer questions. And she is the computer genius. So she has built this platform, which at a quick glance shows you what the entirety of the program has accomplished since it began. You can also toggle and look and examine statistics by year, by county, by multiple counties. This is all publicly available. You can Google it and find it right now if you wanted. I want to highlight just for a second the strength of the economic impact that this program has. And just last year in 2022, throughout the state, there were 397 volunteers performing 3,354 surveys, and University of Florida assigns a dollar value to volunteer time. And for the year 2022, that value was $27.68 an hour. So if all of those hours generated an equivalent of almost $93,000 of time, which is pretty staggering when you consider all of this work being done around the state by volunteers. And to further impress you, if we look at all of those same statistics from the start of the program to the present, we're at almost 1,300 unique volunteers who have contributed over 17,000 hours, resulting in that economic impact of almost $484,000, which is really wonderful that these folks have donated their time and their resources to helping protect this species and helping provide data for the state. I wanted to give you folks just a few highlights of how this program looks. It's a little bit different around the state. So if you direct your attention, you can look at Dixie County, which is up in the Nature Coast, or that armpit area of the state. You'll see that so far this year in 2023, so one survey season, they counted 197 crabs and tagged 58 and have resighted 1. In Pinellas, they counted 154 crabs and tagged 23 of those. They have not resighted any as of yet. Collier County, which is roughly about as south as we are, here in Miami-Dade, they have counted 12 crabs and tagged 10 of those. Still no resights in Collier. And most impressively is Brevard County, which is home to the Indian River Lagoon and a really long expanse of shoreline. And up in Brevard County, you can see that they have counted over 4,300 crabs and tagged more than 150 of them and resighted 2 of them. And it's Indian River Lagoon area, primo horseshoe crab nesting habitat, and very, compared to Miami-Dade County, very little or less coastal development. So here we have probably the smallest, if not one of the smallest programs within the state, but it's still really impressive what has been accomplished. The program launched here in 2022, so just a year and a half ago. I decided to step up and fill the role of county coordinator, such as several of my other fellow Sea Grant Extension agents around the state have. We began surveying at a very small site at Crandon Marina and later added a second site at Virginia Key North Point Park. And then lastly, we were able to add a third site at the Bear Cut Preserve, which is surveyed by our colleagues at Miami-Dade Eco Adventures. And so to give you an idea, these are Google Map images of the 3 survey areas. If you're familiar, Virginia Key and Key Biscayne, where Crandon is located, are practically right next door to one another. So since these surveys are set according to high tide times, this essentially means that we need 2 people at one site, 2 people at the other, and 2 at the third. So that's why having this army of trained volunteers is really important, because all of these things are happening at the same time. Up to this point in Miami-Dade County, we have held 3 training events with 76 participants. Of those, 46 have performed surveys. We have 48 surveys with more than 200 hours contributed to this project. And one of my most favorite outcomes is that we have had 10 spotted crabs. Nothing race-sighted as of yet, but 10 spotted crabs. And from those, we have 9 that have tags on them. I'd like to introduce you to our tagged crabs that are roaming around the waters of Miami-Dade County. First, we've got Frank, he was found at Crandon. Frank has this silhouette because the volunteers who found him were so excited and so focused on their task of their data collection that they forgot to take pictures. So Frank is there. I have a fair idea of what he looks like, but we don't have that confirmation photo. Next found was Bob, another male, also at Crandon. Then a mated pair, Diego and Frida, also at Crandon. Virginia, a female crab, the first found on Virginia Key. Heracles and Hebe, a mated pair found at the Bear Cut Preserve by our Eco Adventures colleagues. And then Jacques and Rachel found at Virginia Key. So I do want to make sure to mention that if you see any of these crabs roaming around and you see them with their little tag on them, to take a picture of that tag and submit a report, because that's how a MARC recapture study works. Once these tags are sighted, then we can see the movements of the crabs, how far they've moved, where they're traveling to after they came ashore to spawn. Another cool development that happened this year was the creation, moving a little bit more into the future, moving from a paper data sheet to an electronic or computer or app-based data entry platform. And this is really cool. Number one, it removes my margin of error for sometimes trying to decipher people's handwriting, but it allows for the data to be instantly uploaded into the data management platform, whereas with the paper surveys, I would get them and then have to manually enter them at the end of each survey season. So this is instant, it works on the phone, and we of course have the paper survey as a background, or excuse me, as a backup plan. So there's a lot that has come from this program, and I want to highlight some of the most critical components. Here in Florida, this is the only tool, this is the only study that exists for tracking the horseshoe crab populations in our state. And the Division of Marine Fisheries Management within FWC has already asked for the data, and they use that to consider into some of their management decisions. the Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch data has already been integrated into one federal stock assessment, with a second one coming up within the next year or two. This is important because, unfortunately, Florida horseshoe crabs are not regulated federally on the Gulf Coast. And that's a little scary because that is where their populations are higher. So there's a larger pool to take from, and they're not regulated on that federal level. They're only regulated by the FWC, which still allows quite a lot to be harvested. This is part of a long-term study. A good rule of thumb, as explained to me by Berlina, a good rule of thumb for a mark recapture study is that it needs to be ongoing for at least the amount of time that it requires an animal to reach maturity in order for the data to start to become valid. And so right now we're 8 years into Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch. So we're starting to creep up on that timeline in the area in which it was launched. And to that end, the data have to be robust. It can't just be 1 year worth of data. We're looking at a minimum of 8 to 10 years for this to be considered truly useful and valid. Another really cool thing that came out of this was the validation of the volunteer collected data. And this was done through an analysis of the volunteers' data alongside data that were collected by professional scientists. And Berlina and Claire Crowley of FWC, my colleague Savannah Berry and Jane Brockman of UF did this analysis and found that volunteers trained through the Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch program produce data that is statistically similar to that of professional scientists, which further gives this project more weight and more credibility. On a more fun and personal note, it has been really neat to see some of the volunteers just embrace their roles. This is a flyer that was created by one of our volunteers here in Miami-Dade County, Linda, who was on survey and she spotted a horseshoe crab, but before she could pick him up out of the water, he got away. So she made this wanted flyer to send and share, and I just got a real big kick out of it. Earlier this year, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, put out a call nationally for anyone who coordinated a volunteer program to submit nominees for excellent volunteer service. And I've just really enjoyed all of my interactions with Linda. She had just made that nifty little poster, so I nominated her, and she was selected. She was selected for this National Showcase of Volunteers. So you can read about her. The website is at the bottom, noaa.gov/education. And this gives her perspective as to why she joined the program and what she got from it. So that was really awesome to see her recognized at that national level. So if your interest is piqued in any aspects of this, there are many things that you can do to become involved with horseshoe crabs or general issues of conservation. And the first, when it comes to horseshoe crabs, is if you're walking along wherever you are and see one that is upside down, to flip it over, and to do so by handling its carapace, its outer shell, not by its telson. If the crabs remain like this for too long and they become too hot or too dehydrated, or if their telson is damaged, they cannot right themselves and they will likely dry out or become food for something else. So flipping an overturned crab by handling it by its prosoma is a great thing to do. Next is staying involved and aware of local environmental and conservation issues. And when you have the opportunity, exercise your right to vote and vote in favor of protection and conservation measures, and people for that matter. When they're available, volunteer for habitat restoration projects or marine debris cleanups. These are activities that are ongoing And unfortunately, the latter is something that has to happen pretty consistently to maintain not only a nice aesthetic in a coastal environment, but to keep that environment free of pollution, to be home and welcoming for different sea creatures like sea turtles and horseshoe crabs and birds. If you are spending time in a coastal area and you see a horseshoe crab, there is the portal available to submit a general report, as well as if you do find one that has a tag on it, that goes into a different database. And what's neat about the tags is you can take a picture of them and then go back and upload it later. So that way it'll have the tag number. So that way we know if Frank or Bob that was tagged off of Crandon, you see him later on Miami Beach, that's an incredible distance traveled. So it'll be really important information for us to know. If you can, participate in Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch in your county. And of course, teach others about some of these issues that we have talked about here today. I'll take this moment to mention that this Sunday, August 13th, is our Fall 2023 Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch training event. It's going to take place at the Biscayne Nature Center, which is located in Crandon Park. And so if you can scan the QR code, I will also include the link when I send the follow-up email. I'll include that registration link. And another neat tidbit is that once you have participated in this training, you are eligible to participate and survey as part of Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch in other counties. And we have several people who do this, who live in one county but have a property in the other and spend time in different areas, and they love it. So before we wrap up, I'm going to ask Ed to launch our one question poll. And this is anonymous. I'm just going to ask you to use your mouse and make your selection and answer this question. Please indicate your level of agreement with the following. I learned something from watching this webinar. A, you strongly agree, meaning you learned a lot. B, you agree, you learned something. Or C, you disagree, you didn't learn anything new at all. So we're going to leave that poll open for another second. I'm going to move on and mention that there are great publications out there that are freely accessible. If any of these are of interest to you, I'm happy to share them via email. And I do want to thank Berlina from FWC, who has really taught me a lot and held my hand through some of the growing pains. And my colleague, Savannah Berry, who has been the other hand holder for me. And especially want to thank the Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch volunteers and you all for listening in. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Ed.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that great conversation. And thank you all for participating in the poll and for coming out tonight for our conservation conversation. So it's now 6:40. So if you have to leave us, that's perfectly fine. We will be staying on now to answer any questions that you guys have. I do see some questions coming into the chat. If you guys have any that you want to share, please go ahead and put them in now. Also, before we jump into those, I did put in a link in the chat. This is the FWC site for reporting horseshoe crab sightings. So go ahead and save that so you have that to use if you're ever out there and you sight a horseshoe crab. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into the questions. Our first question comes from Stuart. So Stuart would like to know, Anna, you didn't mention flamingo in Everglades National Park, and Stuart has some experience. He's sighted quite a few hundred, I suppose, down there along the beach. Has there been any efforts in that region of the state to do these surveys, or is that something that might be added down the road? And his experience there was back from 2013, but he would like to know about that beach and maybe horseshoe crab populations in that region.